All right, this is the board discussion portion of the agenda, and we wanted to go over the memo that was submitted actually a couple of weeks ago on April 9th, which is a follow-up on the income and expense study that responds to a request that we made to the staff to research whether the income and expense profile of stabilized buildings varies depending on the proportion of stabilized units. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Maybe you can summarize the
Sure.
findings, and then we can talk
Yeah,
about
well, just go through
what
the
they mean.
tables, I guess, in each one if people have questions. But essentially, we asked finance to give us RPIE data, breaking it out by, citywide, which we normally get, all the buildings included. Then buildings with 20% or more stabilized, 50% or more stabilized, or 80% or more of the units are rent stabilized.
And by geography.
And by breaking it down by borough and between core Manhattan and the rest of the city.
I'm sorry, Andrew. It's 20% or more stabilized or 20% or less stabilized?
20% or more are stabilized. Right, 50% or more. So 20% is going to include all the other two categories after it, right? 20% or more stabilized, right? So as you go up, fewer buildings are going to be included.
Fewer buildings, okay.
Right. And essentially, the take from the whole thing is that, with the exception of core Manhattan, stabilized buildings throughout the city have similar expense and income profiles, regardless of the proportion of stabilized units. And I think that points to the fact that most of the deregulation is in core Manhattan, where the other boroughs and the city without core, are still majority of the units are stabilized. So those profiles aren't going to change all that much when you get to those groups. So you could probably just, the easiest, unless you have direct questions, we could just go through, sort of look at each table, and then if you have questions about it, just
To understand the three buckets, this table 1 tells us nothing about the population of buildings where very few units are stabilized. Is that correct?
Well, it doesn't separate that group, but it's certainly included in all buildings in the
But
first.
if we wanted to make a claim about buildings with just a handful, less than 20% stabilized, we can't make a claim about
No, we
those
didn't go the
buildings.
other way with it. We didn't look at, buildings with fewer than 20%
And just,
stabilized.
I'm not asking that you do that, but could we do that?
Yeah.
Because that's the point that
It's-
the owner representatives were making.
Well, I think they were making it the other
Yeah,
way.
80% they were making.
Oh, actually,
Right, they were making it the other way, but essentially you're going to end up with core Manhattan. So I'm not sure if there's a reason to go ahead and do that,
Okay,
That
good.
shows this.
Okay.
That's good.
because I think that's what it shows.
Yes.
That core Manhattan has a different
Profile.
profile. Right. So this first table just breaks down simply the rent, income, and costs in each citywide, core Manhattan, and city without core Manhattan. And as you would expect, as the more units that are stabilized, each one of those, the rent, income, cost, the dollar figure declines, which would make sense. So, for example, if you take the average rent, you look at that going across, citywide it was $13.78, and then so if 20% of the more units is stabilized, it's $13.05, $11.74, and $11.39. So it declines going forward. As going ahead, that's true with each one of those categories. And then we'll look at that as it goes forward. Though you're seeing decline in all those areas, so your ratios, your percentages of increases in rent and increases in income and increase in NOI and costs, because those numbers are sort of all declining, those percentages sort of remain the same outside of core Manhattan. So we'll take a look at that. So that's what the first table is showing.
But it's kind of extraordinary. It's kind of extraordinary that average costs decrease almost, inversely to as average, or not inversely, they decrease along with the decrease in rent. So if rent goes citywide from 1,400 to 1,100, but then costs go from 1,000 to 800, it's kind of interesting that landlords are able to keep their costs down as well in the more rent-stabilized buildings.
Right, and we see with the profile of the buildings in core Manhattan, the rents are higher and income is higher, but expenses are significantly higher. So the doorman building, they're union buildings, they're, new buildings, so there's more services, there's more costs related, plus their tax bill is going to be higher simply because
David, I would probably counter your point with, I think this is representing owners are doing whatever they can to cut expenses because they have no income to support it.
So, perhaps that's not good, right? So maybe the position is they're cutting expenses too much. That would be one argument. But the other argument would be, on the other side, would just be, as the landlord representatives noted, that housing deficiencies are near historic lows. So it's I'm not saying it's not both of those things, but it's not like we have a spike in housing deficiencies, right, at this time.
I think there's a difference between a HPD, DOB deficiency versus just a quality of life maintenance issue.
Yeah,
like how well the hallways are taken care of, how clean the streets are, how nicely the trash is put out. You could clean your building every day, or you could clean it once a year.
I agree, but we don't have the only thing we have a metric for is the HPD deficiencies.
But to Scott's point, it may be true that owners, regardless of our guidelines, are probably going to try to operate at a certain
Margin.
Yeah.
And this may be reflecting that, because to them, that's a financially healthy building to operating at a certain margin.
Yeah.
So we don't really know whether this profile, we'd have to see whether, I guess, costs are, the sort of, that costs are decreasing from, prior years to show that, in other words, less money is being spent on the maintenance of the building because of less rent being collected.
A little hard on year to year, but you could look at it 5 or 10 year trends.
If you look at the chart in the I&E about, in the recession impacted owners in that they spent less money on their buildings. Like everyone spent less money on whether they owned a home or whatever. They reduced their costs because of the great, a very, significant recession. So, and that's something you could track over time. So table 2 is just more of an in-depth, and we take a look at that by borough, including separating core Manhattan and upper Manhattan. So it's basically telling the same story. And it's also important to note, we don't use any adjustment when we calculate NOI. We don't adjust the audit numbers. It's only used once. It's used in the income, the expense to income ratio, and that's
Right.
where we lower it. Otherwise,
It's not in the
NOI
commensurates, right? It doesn't affect the commensurates.
doesn't impact the commensurates.
Yeah, so the point that was made by the speaker that we're looking improperly at audit-adjusted numbers is not really accurate. It's
not accurate to NOI.
Yeah.
And then we looked at cost-to-income ratios. And this is where there is an audit adjusted, so we gave you both. Again, this is the cost-to-income ratios, which we do. And as you can see, if you just took, audited and unaudited are going to reflect the same thing. Unaudited is a higher cost-income ratio than the audited amount, but it's doing similar things. So if you take a look at Core Manhattan there, either the audited or unaudited, you can see the cost-to-income ratios increase as the percentage of stabilized units increase. But if you looked at the city without Core Manhattan, or even city without Core Manhattan, there's very little difference in the ratios.
And I think we may have had this conversation last year, but do we have national data on how real estate investors expect cost-to-income ratios to look for their portfolios? Like, is this out of whack with industry standards or consistent with industry standards?
I think the CPC testimony revealed that. I mean, I could circulate that again.
Yeah, I mean,
At the local level,
the tax rates here just for clarity, the tax rates here far exceed anything else in the rest of the country. No other part of the country has a third of income from buildings going to taxes.
Yeah.
In every city, it doesn't exist.
So you're just saying that this is like the New York exception. It's not useful to look outside of. It's not useful to compare to other jurisdictions.
Well, unless we had significant tax reform, and I think we all think that's many years down the road, it will just prove that it's very expensive to operate a building here.
Okay.
I mean, and it'll be 15 to 25% higher here than in other cities or other parts of the country.
But I will say that that's also why they don't have rent stabilization in other parts of the country when they did, because they didn't have the market the same way we have it, and also they didn't have a housing crisis the same way. So I do feel like that those are all things to also consider when thinking about other parts of the country, and like why New York City is so unique, and like why we have to look at the data, really focusing on data and what's happening in the city, because it's like its own thing. You can't compare it to anyone else.
But the taxes are a huge problem.
I don't disagree.
Okay.
I didn't say that it wasn't.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that that is all things to consider, and also that other places don't have rent stabilization for a reason.
Even at the local level, when HCR does their income and expense for NASA and Rockland and Westchester, their expense, it's always lower than the increase in expenses in the city simply because of real estate tax. They just don't get taxed at the increase. Is just the burden's just not as high.
Do we have a comparable for buildings containing no stabilized units, cost-to-income ratio? Because that would reflect the high tax burden in New York, but give us a comparison group as to effectively the impact of rent stabilization on cost-to-income ratios.
Some of the Berman Center will talk about all renters. They will not focus on rent stabilization to give us a little bit more data on what's happening citywide. And other speakers later will talk more about what rent stabilization funds are fixing, sort of get at that, like to compare it to something else. But I don't know if
Do we have that particular data?
We just have to ask them to give us RPIE data that doesn't include any stabilized buildings. I mean, I guess we could look at that.
That could be, I think that would be interesting.
I mean, it very well could be, the core Manhattan picture, but I don't know.
I just had one other comment on table 2.
Table 2? Oh.
What is particularly helpful for me about this nice work you guys have done to break this up is, when we use the 1,300, the mean and the average from prior years, what's interesting as we get into the testimony period is we always hear from people, kind of 1,300 and above. We never hear from someone with a 3-digit rent, or if we do, it's like, kind of 1 in 300 people. And most of who we will hear from at the testimony is 1,350 to 1,800. There's not a lot of people over 2,000. Again, they're kind of like the 3-digit renter. And what's interesting about this, though, is that just citywide, there is a group, that next group under the average, that doesn't testify. You know, so the people who testify are in the, if we could put them into bands, are in the 60 to probably 85%. If we could put them into percentiles. Does that seem logical? Do we have a way to do that?
The fourth quintile?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't show this by quintile, but, so I'm not, I can't speak to the quintile.
Okay.
But yeah, these are median. No, averages, right?
Averages?
Averages, I'm sorry, these are averages, right? So the medians would be half above, half below. So that, I wouldn't suspect, I don't want to comment on the mediums without them here, but
And this is.
I'm sorry, but generally speaking, when we report medians in the regular data, they're always a bit lower, which makes sense. Yeah.
And this includes all section income and.
This is everything, right? But, realize the rent is and income is what they actually received. It's not what the contract rent is, or the gross rent is, or actually for this would be contract rent, but there's always vacancy and collection loss as part of that, because for whatever reason, maybe not all the rent is paid. So it is actual rental income that they have, the average rental income they collected. This is all collected.
Can you remind me, Andrew, how many, how many small, I think one of the things that are difficult for me in some of the testimonies is that we're focusing on the same thing that you're saying about tenants, but we're also focusing on small landlords and the impact of our decisions on the small landlords. But we have data to actually talk about that impact, and even within the testimonies that we hear, they're all really anecdotal. I think from the tenant's perspective, from my perspective, from the tenant side, we do have concrete data that actually shows income for the landlords based on rent, not what tenants are paying necessarily. And then we get the HBS of 3 years old who actually supplement some of this stuff. But I don't feel like we have that for landlords. I think it would be interesting, even though the data doesn't exist, if we had, and this is also tricky for us from my perspective as a tenant advocate. And we don't actually have data on how many units landlords own, because they're LLCs, and so I always ask every year, which I didn't, because the answer's the same, is who is a small landlord and how you define small landlord. And then on top of that, what are the actual, can you give us concrete breakdowns of what that actually looks like? And there's only one person in Queens who brings an actual breakdown of what expenses are, but I think he gave us the same thing 2 years in a row. And so I do feel I think that's something to look at and consider, and when we talk about all of these things, that most of the folks that own these units, especially for specific in the Bronx, are huge landlords who own 50, 80, hundreds of units. And I could give you a list of who they are and actually pinpoint where they are. And there's a whole bunch of data from the BIB data that, what is that called? Fordham University, one of their projects actually puts together, and that we use to do outreach to tenants. It actually shows you what the building was last sold for, what was the actual, what it says on the deed, all the information in one place. And I think that's really useful for us on what's happening in that 3-month period, to sort of address some of this stuff, because I don't know. We don't get testimonies from those small landlords. We don't get many testimonies. We also don't get data from them to counter anything. And so I don't know. It's like a business practice. If I'm looking at these just as numbers, the income is something and the cost to put out the units, and you still have an NOI to figure out what to do. And if you're making a bad business practice because you got a mortgage that was way over leveraged for whatever reason, that is I feel like those are all things to consider in how we make our decision, and should not be the end all on how we make a decision on the board. And our mandate isn't to make sure that there are rent increases. If you read the text, it actually says rent adjustments. And so I think that is clear that we should be looking at the data and making decisions based on whether there should be increases, rent reductions, or zeros as we move forward.
Well, we don't have, income and cost and expense data for the units that are fewer than 11 units, buildings, but we did a memo last year that broke out data that shows about 10% of the units are in those buildings. So if you're making a decision about the, other 90% of the units there, you have data. And I can't speak to owners, like if it's a small owner or not a small owner, but those are the number of buildings that are in that category.
And do we have anecdotal information about the types of costs that the small buildings have? Because they don't have doormen, they're probably not unionized. I mean, wouldn't we tend to think that their costs are on the lower side as a general rule?
I mean,
Self-managed by the
maybe
owner?
more of a profile of the 11 to 19 unit buildings. Yeah, but I don't want to start making generalizations about data that we don't
Yeah,
have,
okay.
right? But there are significant things, and I think if you have a 6 or 7 unit building and one tenant isn't paying rent, then that can make or break your year. Or on the opposite side, if you have a small building with 2 regulated units, you're going to be doing better. I don't know. It's hard without data. I'm not, it's hard to. All I can say is it's about 10% of the units, and are contained in buildings, that have at least one stabilized. That's the citywide data. So I'd have to see if we could break down the units for the data that we have now. I could see if we could do that.
And so what's considered a small owner, like 6 to 10?
Well, it's a definition of small owner. If you have, it's the number of units they own, I think, is a better definition. If you have one building owner that owns one building that has 12 units, it's fine. But if you have a person who owns 30 buildings that all have 12 units, I wouldn't call that person a small owner per se. But, I guess you got to look at it
More like
more
an
of like
volume.
the owner who owns one building or
More
two
buildings.
buildings, maybe.
By building.
Or the number, actually, it would be more about the number of units, I think, that they own, rather than whether they own one building. Because if you own one building that has 100 units, I don't know if you're a small unit or not. So it's probably more about the number of units. And there's certainly, we've heard testimony from CPC last year about how, certain buildings, and even from ANHD, I think, about how, owners who have multiple buildings will use income from other buildings to maintain the building that's not doing well. So they have economy of scale, and they have some other options where if you own 20 units in total, and you may have 2 buildings, but you won't have that luxury necessarily.
Andrew, do we have a sense from in the testimony, the percentage of pre-1974 buildings that are rent stabilized? Or what would that be?
Yeah, I'll circulate this memo again. Of course, it's just one majority. So pre-47, the number of units, it's about 780,000. In post-46 buildings, it's about 380,000 units.
You're
So
asking
the
about
majority of the
74?
units are in the pre-47.
1974. So there was a point made that most of CHIP members were living predominantly pre-1974 buildings and aren't.
Yeah, well, that's the demographic through the whole city too, because most of the building stock is before 1974.
But also, of the 380, we have somewhere else in our materials this week about the 421A buildings, which I think are 10% of the 800,000 stabilized unit number that's quoted. So of the 380, you could take about 90 or 100,000 off. Those are new construction, and that's the world of the 47 to 1980. Sorry, that's the world of 47 to 1978. Because everything built after 78 would either be market rate or it would only be rent stabilized if it was in a 421A building.
I didn't understand the conversation around, though, I think this 1974 date, which had something to do with rent
74, they don't have to be rent stabilized if it's built after 1974.
I see, all right.
Any, so, like.
Yeah, they're only stabilized with some sort of
Okay.
tax abatement,
Okay.
essentially. Yeah.
Thank you.
There is no, you can build without being rent stabilized after
But
70.
those would probably be, unless they renewed, would be opting out if they received tax breaks by then, because it's within 30 years. So like those are buildings that we work in all the time. Who are
Well, we-
exiting 421A.
Right, we track those 421As that come out of stabilization, our changes report. So yeah, every year there's units that come out.
When do we get the changes report?
May,
Okay.
May meeting.
Do we have any preliminary?
It's in the
Data?
HCRs, I believe. The number of units that registered as leaving. I believe they include it in their submission, which would be from last week. Yeah, I'm sure I have it in my.
Well, what we,
6,657.
Oh, there you go. What was the year before?
7,524.
and those are, we don't know why those are leaving.
We will once we have the report. They break it all down.
Oh, okay, great.
It's always, I mean, deregulation is the large majority of this.
So getting beyond the
20.
The $2,700.
Well, 2733.75 now, I think, something like that. Yeah, for those who are new to the board, they actually, vacancy deregulation, the dollar amount is impacted by the 1-year guideline. So if there's a 0% guideline, then that would remain the same. But since there was a 1.25% 1-year guideline, it went from 2,700 to 2,733.75, I think is 1.25, somewhere around that. So it does impact that.
Can the city tell us, for the new Housing New York plan, there has been an attempt to keep units from exiting through enhanced affordability, where the building goes from 20% affordability to 30 or 35% affordability permanently, and then the balance of the units can function as market rate. Can the city tell us how many people, how many buildings and units have applied for that program, been accepted to it, and executed on it?
I think it's probably it's in the new, I don't know what they call it anymore. It's the new housing plan?
Yeah.
They don't report that?
But Layla brought those numbers last year, and when we asked the HPD person that came us.
Oh, Liz, yeah.
She did mention that she would give us that data, like actually break it down. Because they did give us like the income, the tenant's income, the average rents, the unit sizes, actually by square foot. And they have all of that data because it's through Housing NYC Connect.
Right, so, yeah, I mean, we asked them to include the housing metrics of all the affordable housing, but we haven't received
I
that
don't think it's laid out in that level of detail.
in the report.
Housing New York plan.
Okay.
They have details in there, but I don't think it gets down to that level of detail.
Yeah, I mean, there's a limited number of buildings that this, the world of this is tiny, tiny, tiny. It's just interesting if because then people are doing the economic calculation of, if I provide more affordability, does the additional years of tax subsidy pay off, or does it make sense just to, it's a crazy idea that these 20% units just end. It was a real mistake in the law when it was written, but.
Other questions?
Andrew, you're going to go through the other table. I thought there's some really interesting information in the table.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's useful to us to. Yeah, this is really useful information.
Okay, so the table 4, I think we're on now, which is, actually, I think we finished, yeah, table 4. So we took a look at a longitudinal look at the 2 years of data to see what the adjustments in rent, increase, rent, income, cost, and NOI. As you can see, again, core Manhattan is sort of the anomaly here in these categories, particularly in income growth and NOI. As the number of percentage stabilized goes up, the NOI growth at the 80% plus was nearly flat. And that was, somewhat had to do with income growth being less. But if you take a sort of a look at the other parts of, like citywide, it was very similar when it was looking at, I'm sorry, with city without core Manhattan, the percentages were very similar across all these different building types.
So I'm going to just ask some questions, but
Sure.
I'm not sure if I'm reading it right. So interestingly, core Manhattan had low NOI growth, but really even amongst its 20% or more stabilized. So they had low growth compared to the rest of the city. So it's just interesting. So rents,
It's simply the they're operating on the market,
Yeah,
the margin.
yeah.
Yeah, which is always the case with higher rents. Even in buildings where there's deregulated units, NOI growth is going to fluctuate depending on what the market is doing. And right now, for what I understand, the market for rentals is pretty stagnant in terms of owners being able to increase rent.
yeah.
So, and that's reflective. So it's sort of a little bit
Rents are going up
yeah.
everywhere, but rents are going up elsewhere, though.
Elsewhere, they're going up.
Significantly, yeah.
Yeah.
And then if you look at rent growth, so rents over that period went up how much in a 1 year, or what's the average rent growth for rent stabilization? What did we approve for the 2 years covered by this? We approved an increase of 1 and
0 and 1.25.
It's 0 and 1.25, I think, covers these 2 years. Or maybe not.
and then for 2 year leases, so it's like, we approved like
2.
1.5
It
or
was
a
2
2
yeah,
on average.
2%. But wait, if it's,
But these
These would
numbers,
be
these are
calendar year.
2016.
yeah, it'd be calendar year 15 and calendar year 16. So now you're going to tax my memory. So it was
Really low.
it was
One
a
is a
rent
0.
freeze, and 0 and 2, and then it was, I guess 1 and
No.
no, it's 1 and a quarter.
But we're
I
we're saying
haven't.
rent stabilized rents went up like about 1% in that period.
Well, authorized by this board, but there's other ways that they
It
go.
was
around.
1%.
No, I understand, but it's interesting, because even in the 20%, so if you look at rent growth in core
1%
Manhattan.
and 0 were the guidelines for the 1 years. 2.75 and 2 for,
Average that to about 1.25 or something like that. But even in the 20% or more stabilized, rents only went up 3.1% in core and 3.3 citywide. I mean, it's just interesting that there's not a humongous gap between the 20% and more stabilized and the 80% more unstabilized. In other words, rents were not much higher in buildings with,
The percentage growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to do percentage growth. Wasn't much different from,
Yeah, yeah.
rents are much higher, but,
right, but I just mean that
The growth in
universe
rent.
of 20% plus stabilized and 80% plus stabilized is not that different, and you might have thought it would be different because rent
yes.
stabilization increases were not that high.
Yeah, I think that would fluctuate depending on the particular year. It just happened to be a year where
The
I think
economy was
rents are
soft.
stagnant on
Yeah,
top
okay,
of the
all right.
market. I mean, Scott can speak more to that, but I think that's
Not
the
telling.
case.
Yeah,
So
okay, all right.
it dampened, things that were happening.
But it does, I think what's useful about this is that to the extent we were thinking about targeted increases based on percentage of stabilized units, it really doesn't look supportable.
It would be marginally useful.
Yeah.
And so complicated too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And subject to legal challenge.
No, they mean the,
So that's really useful to know
And I
that.
think
Yeah.
that was the conversation we were having, especially when we kept hearing that it was gonna be so much, like, we're gonna see a huge difference between big buildings and smaller buildings. And I feel like this actually does help us address those concerns that keep coming up.
So it seems like the big meaningful difference is core Manhattan versus everything else, and all the other ways you could slice up the pie are of.
Which is
limited
why
use.
we've always separated in the I&E data anyway.
Yeah, okay.
It's always been sort of, and that's, so I think that's useful.
I do think, though, it would be interesting to know whether, and I don't know if there's a way of figuring this out, whether costs are being, whether owners are just maintaining NOI by putting less into buildings than they did when they were getting guideline increases. I don't know if there's any way to measure that.
I mean, is this like to Scott's point that,
Yeah.
cleaning once a year, once a week?
Yeah.
And I don't think we can get that granular.
Probably not, but it's a concern
Yes.
that what's going on is that the response to lower increases or no increases is simply to cut back on maintenance. I mean, if that were something that could be understood or demonstrated, it would be of concern. And it's being suggested by the owners. I mean, anecdotally.
Data said that if, I'm trying to look for what they said, but my understanding was that overall the housing stock is more healthy, has been more healthy, and continues to be more healthy. So I do feel like they probably might issue more heat and hot water violations, but a lot of them don't actually end up being violations.
Right. I think Scott's point, though, was that it's not so much about HPD-type violations as it is
Quality of life issue.
about more just quality of life, maintenance issues.
Yeah, I think that's what the HVS looks at, it doesn't take into account violations, it's just talking about the main, what condition the building is in.
Well,
Measured by how?
Measured by the survey, I'm not sure what. is-
Self-reported by tenants.
I'm not sure how do you know how they handle, hold on, Danielle. You got to sit and put your mic on, though, you can't. And Danielle's our HVS expert, so she know better than me.
I think there probably are some things they ask tenants, how many roaches have been in your apartment, and there are other things that they visually observe, if the windows are boarded up, if there's other things that they can visually see, if the stairwell is in good shape. So there's certain things they ask the tenant and certain things they visually observe. To the last point, Andrew can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not the I&E person, but the PIAC measures the increase in costs. We survey vendors, things like that. But the I&E costs are what owners are actually spending. So, I mean, the most recent data is 2016, but if they were spending less money, then the NOI might stay the same. You'd see the income flat or down and the costs down, and I don't think
No.
we saw that.
No, costs keep going up.
Costs
The
keep
question
going
is,
up.
would they go up more, I guess?
Yeah, they
If
could have
they're-
gone up more, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you saw costs remaining flat and we kept measuring expense changes in the price index, then owners are no longer, they're deferring maintenance or they're getting, so I don't think we can come to any sort of conclusion, are they deferring maintenance? Because the dollar amount they're actually spending on costs is going up every year. So I don't, but there could be some deferred maintenance in that, I don't know.
But that's just going to be impossible to address.
It's pretty speculative, yeah. Should we look, did you want to look at the
I
rest
just
of
think,
the?
I think tables 6 and 7
Six.
are somewhat interesting. I found them interesting, so I don't know if, we want to talk about them. Table 5, I didn't really delve into, but it is interesting to see the amazing difference in where the 80% stabilized are,
Yep.
core Manhattan is a different universe, there's only 27% of the buildings with rent stabilized units have 80% or more stabilized, so that's a totally different universe than just about everywhere. Manhattan, it's what Andrew keeps saying, Manhattan is different, but it's interesting to see how different, Bronx is if a building is stabilized, the whole building is stabilized no matter what. That's important to know. And that, that speaks to some of the landlords' concerns that, maybe Bronx landlords, they're really suffering from our increases in a way that, Upper Manhattan landlords are not. 94% of Bronx landlords are getting just the stabilization increase, but only 63% of Upper Manhattan ones are. That's a meaningful difference.
Well, same for Brooklyn, too. Brooklyn's at 90%, so Brooklyn and the Bronx both have similar aged housing stocks.
So if you were talking about a small owner of a 10-unit building in the Brooklyn or Bronx, there's a good chance that their increase from year to year is going to be driven a lot by what we set, whereas that's not true in Upper Manhattan, and obviously not true in Core Manhattan.
But just to be also clear, that the housing stock is a lot more dense and larger. Like
In-
in the Bronx, for example, it's really rare to find a building that's less than 25 units that's rent stabilized.
Okay.
And so on average, any building that we work in at my job is 55 units, and that's the average number of units. And then there's like the 230 unit buildings. And so I don't.
So they don't have the Brooklyn
Right.
4-story,
Yeah, we don't-
8-unit building.
We have a few, it's just, there's still like over 20 units. And so they're walk-ups, 5-story walk-up, but it's like, 2 apartments per floor or something,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
3 apartments per floor. And so I do feel like it's just a different
Population,
group.
yeah.
And then if you look at like DHCR data, that's actually broken down by borough, the vacancies or the MCIs, the amounts that the Bronx is seeing, for example, which is mostly rent stabilized, you're seeing $13 of MCI increases applications. And so I do feel like we're still seeing same level of rent increases in other parts of the city. If you look at it like by what the market is actually varying. And I would say that, I don't know if this is true about vacancies, but if we could look at the vacancies in those dense areas would probably be a lot smaller because it's cheaper. And so
Right.
it's harder to move from apartment to apartment. If you get evicted, the likelihood that you'll end up in a cheaper apartment is not really great.
Agreed, but then from a landlord perspective, that is bad for them in terms of increasing rent because they're not going to get vacancy. They're not going to get a vacancy allowance. So if you have a very low vacancy rate, then you're less likely to get a vacancy bump when you.
Why wouldn't you get evicted?
Because if people turn over a lot less in the Bronx because it's hard to get a new apartment.
I don't know if that's true.
Oh, I thought that's what you just said.
That is true, because that's one of the.
Because we have a lot of preferential rent, so all the 30% of the market is rent stabilized. I mean, in like where I work, 74% are rent stabilized. 30, on average, most people that we get having problems with their leases and high increases have preferential rents. And then many of the buildings that we're working on have MCIs. And so I don't know necessarily like how to put all those things together and
Yeah.
have a bigger picture. But I think those are all things that we have to take into account and make the decision on like whether tenants are still being rent or landlords are seeing increases. But I think the data clearly says that the rents are going up regardless of what borough you're looking at and the number of rent stabilized units.
Yeah, the Bronx did have the lowest vacancy rate for rentals, which is 2.71%.
Because there's that also, the lower the rent, there's that chart that has the lower the rent, the lower the
Turnover.
It seems to me this also suggests that outside of core Manhattan, this argument that that rent stabilized units are sort of being subsidized by non-stabilized units doesn't really hold.
It's very slight.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's a big, both policy argument that they make and political argument is that, somehow we're taking into account income from market rate or non-stabilized units, and that's essentially subsidizing the rent stabilized units, but that doesn't really make sense, at least outside of core Manhattan, based on this data, if I'm looking at it
If
correctly.
you're looking at the 50% number, that seems strong because there's a lot of numbers are in the 90s, right? Bronx is 98, Brooklyn is 95, Queens is 91. So
Yeah.
in those boroughs, it doesn't seem, or unless those handful of people are somehow dramatically subsidizing, everyone else in the building.
It also suggests that outside of core Manhattan, if we did the analysis that was suggested, which is kind of foreshadowed by this, which is to just remove from the I&E study any building that is less than 50% stabilized, that it would not, it's unlikely to show that there's unlikely to be a really big difference other than in core Manhattan.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
This answers a big.
Yeah, a big question that we've had.
Right, but core Manhattan also too has all of the parking and the extra income from retail as well. So core Manhattan has a lot of anomalies.
Yes.
That get compounded.
Right. No, I can see
Andrew,
that.
will this kind of data be incorporated on a regular basis in staff reports going forward? This is like really useful.
Well, the question is it, like Kathy just said, whether, I mean, now that we know it, do we need to do it every year? I mean, I'd have no problem doing it.
Memory, or the institutional memory, I guess. So.
Right, I mean, we could redo this every time and then maybe incorporate it into the report. Generally, when we do something new, we do it as memo first rather than putting it in the report, and then the consensus, well, do we put it in the report now or do we leave it out?
I think this is very useful to have in the public report.
Okay.
Because,
It responds to a lot of the concerns.
yeah,
raised in testimony.
I mean,
Right.
it's a little counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And so it's important that that it be out there for, I mean, I don't know how much people, follow these memos, but I think in terms of both having the facts out there and opening up this for further discussion, if there's something about this data we're missing, that having it in the reports makes sense.
Okay.
I don't know if other people disagree, but I find it very useful.
For us, like we were having this conversation of tier systems because we thought that all of these things would be different. But looking at it now, I feel like I don't even think that those arguments are sound anymore. It's like really clear.
Just to take a step back, we've been tracking the units by borough that have been subtracted, and, none of this should be surprising to any of us, but so about 107,000 units in Manhattan have been deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation. The next borough is Brooklyn at 21,000, then
Wow.
Queens at 18,000, and the Bronx only 4,700. So we should not be particularly surprised, and that's from up to 2016.
Yeah.
So
Deregulation is not what's driving this,
it's
outside of
it's much more Manhattan,
Manhattan, core Manhattan.
but it is, I think.
We have such a little impact on core Manhattan in a way. It's almost not, our decision has such a small impact on them.
The numbers, skews the numbers, and we don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, and the last chart, I think, is also really interesting.
Distressed properties, yeah.
Yeah, because except for 80% stabilized in core Manhattan, it's roughly, the proportion of distressed buildings is the same whether you're 20% stabilized or 80% stabilized. That's also really interesting. That means that, the stabilization, being heavily stabilized is not driving your distress. That's amazing to know. I mean, that's a big fact.
Right.
And I would be curious. I'd be curious as to what's going on with core Manhattan. Are property taxes just destroying?
Yeah, I would say property tax, plus their expense, yeah.
I mean, those are harder buildings to, right, like, not to make a point for landlords, but I think they're harder buildings to manage. Because the property taxes are being higher, the value of the actual property would be higher. And so if you're gonna take out a mortgage on a building that you need to put a ton of money to repair, I just feel like how do you make that work?
Yeah. But I just wonder if at some point we'd want to ask somebody at the city, like at HPD, about these heavily stabilized buildings in Manhattan. Are they, the landlords keep telling us there's a crisis brewing that we're helping to create and that we're unaware of. And if you were to look at this, the only place you'd see a potential crisis would look like it's in 50% plus stabilized core Manhattan. That seems like an outlier from everything else. And I just
Well,
wonder.
it's also 80 buildings.
It's not that many buildings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that, I mean,
That's what I was just
it's
looking
not
at.
10.7%.
Yeah.
This is not a,
Right.
Scheme of the world.
yeah, yeah.
You gotta
Error.
You've got to.
look at the
Yeah.
numbers. So, yeah, so putting that in perspective, I think.
Is that though based on number of units?
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
be good to.
Replicated based on unit number?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
80 buildings of 200 units, it becomes a real number.
Yeah, the number of units.
Mhm.
And
Well, it tells you something about what type of building is distressed.
Yeah, it's a little bit like this chart. When we did it in units, it really shows we're kind of in, I don't want to say a recession, but in something that's replicating the economic, the recessionary period of 2008. And it only really showed when it got put in units. When it was showed in building, it looked a little smoother.
Yeah, but it's
It showed
basically the same
but
pattern,
it
yeah.
just showed a little more severity in the data.
Yeah, yep. It was a good, I'm glad you asked us that. It was an interesting exercise. And that one blip is
Massive, yeah.
the sale of actually Sidetown twice.
Yeah, once Peter Cooper and once
Once.
Stuytown.
No, they were sold
Sold
twice.
two times.
Oh, it was sold twice because of the
one distress sale.
craziness, yes.
Well, wonder if you did this for site plan. It's 13,000.
Yeah, but it's,
Then you look at the building, it would be just like the building.
it would be more like the buildings.
So it just distorts.
But also the trends are.
It's still only 1 point. It still only represents 1 point. 2 points. So Stuytown sold in 2008. It's already on the downward trajectory. Stuytown's selling right here.
Twice in
I
there.
understand that, Brian. But we need to have the dates after. Stuytown sells the second time, and here's the second time it sells 13 or 14 times. Pull this would pull the curve all the way down.
Could I ask you some questions from the landlord testimony of just?
Sure.
So these are the things that I thought were challenges to the board and to the staff that, and I think we've talked about some of them last year, but just to, I guess maybe put it on the table, these are the methodological concerns that the landlords raised that I think you've actually probably answered, but I don't have it in my head, and maybe for some of the other members it's useful too. So they're criticizing your the staff's or the board's methodology regarding operating expenses. Is there any way we can make it better? Like, is there, are we doing the best that we can do, or is there anything else that we can do to respond to their concern that we're not accurately measuring operating expenses?
You talking about the PIOC?
Well, I mean, they were talking about it in particular category, what was Michael from Rebney? Well,
Well,
Yeah,
there
I
are
mean-
there are two different issues. One is what we're capturing in the PIOC, because they're claiming there are things that we should be looking at in the PIOC that we're not.
and the new mandates being a totally, so the staff has been measuring increases in a bundle of costs, but they're saying with all these mandates imposed by city council, there's a new set of costs that should be added onto the base, and then also potentially measured over time. Are they right, and how would we do that if they are right?
The I&E data should be reflective of expense. If it's not a major capital expense, then it
Including
should
soft
be in there.
costs.
So if you're paying fees for, either
Local law
registration
11
fees or
Inspection.
if they're claiming that the facade's not an MCI expense or something like that.
It should be in their
It
expense
should be
data.
in the RPIE. If it's a major capital expense, we're not capturing it in the I&E. But the other expenses, we would eventually capture in the I&E.
So until they come to us with some submission that demonstrates that we're missing some category of expenses,
Right.
we don't need to worry
Right.
about that for now.
if you add an expense in a price index, it's not going to be measured until 2 years of data. You can't just add expense to a price index. That's not how it works. So if there's a new item that comes online, I'm not capable of capturing into that.
But they're making a bigger claim. They're saying that we're missing categories.
Well, in a price index, now we could insert in the price index, say something that represents a fee. We're not going to do, if an owner has 30 different fees they pay to the city over the course, we're not going to measure all 30. We don't do it that way with anything. So if we added a fee, we'd go, but it would only impact the price index if there's a change in cost. So if the $70, if you have a $75 fee you have to pay every year to the city for whatever reason, and if that doesn't change over time, it would actually have the impact of dampening the price index, but it wouldn't, because it would carry such a little weight that it would have no impact, basically. So if it's only a change in cost in that particular fee, so capturing additional costs should be done in the RPIE if it's not a major capital expense. So I believe we do eventually capture it, but they have a point if it's a new fee that's not in the RPIE data, and it's not something we can measure with the price index.
We're 2 years behind.
But they're making a stronger point
Yeah.
than that. They're not just saying you're lagging, they're saying you're missing. And so, but you're saying we're not missing.
If it's not a major, if it's a major capital expense, we are not measuring that. I will agree with them on that. But whether it's a fee that's been added, that is a regular operating and maintenance expense, and it's something they can put down in the RPIE, which I would imagine a significant portion of it is. I can't go without looking at all the different ones that they eventually get captured.
On the major capital improvements, so their other critique, which I think they made last year as well, is that we're capturing the increase in revenue from the MCI increase, but we're not catching the initial expenditure for the major capital improvement. And I think you addressed this last year, but is that a legitimate critique of what we're measuring? Or should we somehow incorporate that?
Eventually, the cost is recovered and then maintains. It's still included in the rent. So eventually that cost
How?
is, well, they paid for it. The MCI increase is a permanent increase. So if you get an increase on that, that amount is going to be maintained beyond the cost of recouping. So yes and no. I mean, they're recouping expense at the same time that they're laying out expense, because they're recouping, it balances out over time. I believe it balances out over time.
It
'Cause you're
does.
recouping it.
If, for example, a landlord installs an entirely new elevator that's a new model, they most likely will apply for an MCI, and if it's granted, then it becomes a permanent addition to a permanent increase in addition to the tenant's rent. And so the tenant pays that over time, and the amount is based off of, I believe, 1/40th to 1/60th of the expenses, and are calculated, but it is a permanent part of the tenant's rent, so it is an income.
It continues even after the expense is recouped.
But so I get all of that, but I mean, what they're claiming though is, so that's reflected in income, but they're also saying, so if you spend $1 million in year one, and then you collect $25,000 in perpetuity, that our numbers reflect the $25,000 in increased rent in perpetuity, but doesn't at all reflect the million. And so the question is there a better way to do that? Can we look at the net present value of the MCI and offset that against the capital expenditure in some way, so that we reflect both the cost and the revenue?
Well, we can't reduce rent by, there's no way to adjust rent by MCI, and there's no way to capture a capital expense.
Why not?
Because there's no one measures that. There's no data that measures that.
There's no data.
So why shouldn't we have to,
We get the application data.
for the MCI?
We get the approved application.
But not on a building by,
I don't think they relate it to the building, though. the rent registrations by owner is going to reflect an increase. An application of an MCI is something different.
It would
I
be
don't-
interesting,
I don't think they marry the two data sets. From the sound of what they've testified, they don't marry those two. That's why they simply give us an entire amount of MCI that was applied for and approved, because they can't put it in any sort of per unit.
But then,
Basically.
shouldn't we adjust MCI to discount for the original? So let's say the $25,000 a year in perpetuity
But there's a
has
whole
an.
bunch of other stuff, so like there's a retroactive expenses, so sometimes because it takes so long for the landlord to recoup the money from the MCI, DACR will say, it took us too long. Now you can, in addition to the 6% a year, you can also add in this retroactive fee that sometimes it's like $50 every month in addition to the MCI until the landlord collects that original retroactive fee. So I feel like there's and I don't know why they can't do this. I feel like they should be able to track it, like you said. It's in the same block and lot, the same exact address. You have to say where you're saying the MCI is happening.
What was an approved application?
Right.
As a whole.
Yeah, but I don't think it's digitally, I don't think they digitally enter necessarily these applications, but
I have another question, though, which is whether it makes a difference, given how much income there is being attributed to MCIs and how much expense in the great totality of what we're looking at. I mean, is this really a material amount of money that we're talking about in the big income and expense picture?
Of billions of what? Of capital expenditures or billions of rent increases?
Capital expenditures.
Is tens of, yeah, or, yeah.
I mean, I just announced their, whatever,
Mhm.
$300 billion capital.
They're 2.5 billion, but they need $25 billion of deferred capital repairs.
Well, it would be interesting then to maybe there's a way of just to get a peek at what this would look like, is to look at some sample of buildings that have had MCI increases and see how it changes the rent to income ratio if you include the proportionate, annual proportionate MCI expense. I mean,
I think the challenge with that would be that you would have to, it varies so much by where the building is.
Yes.
Especially like just in the Bronx, like on 161 near the Yankee Stadium, an MCI will be $2 million, but 10 blocks up, the MCIs are like $200,000.
but if you look, I'm looking more at the ratio, though.
I think you can't marry the two. They're two different data sets, that's the problem.
I would make a slightly different point from Kathy's point to see whether this is useful or not. But I mean, I guess the way I'm thinking about it conceptually is you don't have data on expenditures, but you do have data on income. And so the staff has taken the position that we include the data we have and just don't worry about the data we don't have. And the landlords are saying, if you're not going to include the data on expenditures, you shouldn't include the data on rents. And so that should be considered. I mean, that's not an unreasonable position. But then the other possibility would be if you looked at the net present value of the cash flow of the MCI in perpetuity and compared that to the annual expenditures on MCIs, you might be able to net them out in a way that tells you what the excess cash flow landlord gets from MCIs over their cost of capital improvements. And why is that not a more theoretically appropriate response than include data on income but not on expenses?
The other argument is that the capital expenditure is just that, it's a capital investment, it's not an expense, because it's increasing the value of the building.
But then the MCI is in theory just an income stream used to pay for that capital. I mean, it's a particularized income stream. I mean, I'm not saying
Yeah.
I'm right, but I think there's some logic to their critique.
I understand the concern, but I'm
Yeah,
dubious as to how we can get at
I'm not
it.
sure of the answer.
I don't see I'm not sure you can get at it, because the costs, they're two different data sets, too. I mean, you're talking about MCIs, which are registered with HCR, and then we have cost data that's part of finance. I'm not sure that can be wedded in any way.
If we know in this year $10 billion in MCIs, and then we know the net present value of MCI payments in perpetuity, why wouldn't it make sense to net those two numbers?
I don't think we can get to those perpetuity numbers. I don't.
Doing a net present value of an annual amount should be easy.
But it's not an annual amount. It changes all the
No,
time.
the MCI is set, right?
It depends, like if, it could be 4% for one building and 6% in another
But
building.
once it's awarded, it's set for that unit.
Right, well, there's
It's-
the dollar amount per room
Right.
is what, I think that gets to what your question is. I don't know how to get the other part of your question, which is how do you marry them together? I don't think you can. But if you look at 2017, on average, every MCI that was granted increased the rent by $13.15 per room.
So we could multiply the number of rooms times
But we never
13.
know.
Yeah, but we don't know the number.
Nothing's.
Nothing's-
And some
nothing's-
MCIs include dining rooms because the dining room is considered a room, some don't have that. So it would be almost impossible to do that. Even when we work in a building, we have to know how many rooms that tenant has to make sure the MCI is actually capturing what the increase actually is. And often it's incorrect. And we have to go back to DACR and say, hey, you said that person had 5 rooms, they actually have 4 rooms. And they're like, oops, when it was first registered, it had 5, or we considered 5. And so I do feel like, I don't know how to get at it.
I'm not, and it's not simply just the change in rent. It's not like as though you can back out our guideline plus MCI increase, but it's not, and it's not registered per room, it's registered as an apartment. So the registration data is not going to help us and that's the rent.
But so if you're right, then why, just as playing devil's advocate, why should we just not reflect? Or why shouldn't we have a chart that reflects it not reflecting MCI?
We don't have a way of doing that. We don't have a way of breaking out the portion, the income stream.
But I do feel like, I think one point I would make is that there are many ways increases happen, to your earlier comment about rents are still increasing even though we had historic lows and zeros. These are the streams, right? The MCIs, preferential rents, and fees, and additional things that are happening in buildings, including storefronts and other things, and parking, and all of that stuff is included in the income. So I do feel like, I think trying to pull it out is a little bit, would be insane, first of all, because I don't think we can do it, but then the second piece is I think that it actually does give us a snapshot of what the income is for a landlord in a real way. I do think, to your point, is I would argue, to repeat what Andrew said earlier, that landlords do recoup that money. And it is a huge investment. Often after MCIs, buildings are flipped, especially in the Bronx. So,
Well, the other thing to do is, and maybe this is a possibility, I don't know, you tell me, Andrew. Maybe there's a way of excluding buildings that have MCIs. Because if you just take MCIs out of the picture totally, you'd be looking at the universe of buildings that had only either guideline, where the rent increases were only guideline increases or preferential rents or some other.
Push you into the 421A stuff.
Yeah, but that's only.
Really?
And it's only going to measure that.
I think it's not.
I don't know how you eliminate those buildings.
Okay. It was just a thought as a way to get around the fact that we can't.
To Scott's point, I think that you end up with a higher rents in there from the 421A, because they tend to have, even DCR's numbers are huge, they're insane. It's like $3,000 on average, they said.
Well, they're part of the core Manhattan.
Right.
Yeah, they're dormant buildings, core Manhattan, they're all.
We
less
could
than 20.
exclude those two.
Both core
Try to get at, I'm just trying to get at the,
How MCI should be properly reflected in the numbers.
The other thing to think about is the work done for an MCI is a little bit different from regular maintenance. It's literally like revamping a building or what would be a renovation. So, like when we're talking about traditional operating expenses, I think there's an argument that it's not really like what all landlords are going to go for under the actual expenses.
Well, I was sort of alluding to that when I was talking about it being actually a capital investment as opposed to an expense.
Yeah, which is what the percentage increase in expense is, regardless of the I&E data or the PIOC, it's operating and maintenance, it's not capital. But the other issue with MCI, it's registered as, but I don't know if they could tell there's multiple MCIs going on at once
Yes.
as well. That would be more difficult. I mean, you can pull out annual data where there was an MCI increase, but it doesn't mean that there's not other MCIs going on at the same time.
I don't know, it's still attached to the unit. Yeah, I don't.
It's still going to be, yeah, and it's attached to the owner registration data. It's as good as the owner registration data. Whereas limited is what that they ask the owner.
Do we know
You don't
what?
even know the number of rooms. Like, that's why I don't think they wed the MCI data with registration data, because that's only registering a unit, not a room. So when you do an MCI application, you have to put each room, the number of rooms in each.
Is there a way of finding out what percentage of buildings even have or have ever had MCIs?
I don't. We could try to get. I don't know.
I'd just like to get a sense of what universe
It's not
we're
in the-
talking
it's not
about
in
here.
there.
Has to have that info. If they know the total amount of dollars spent on MCI, they
I'd
must
like to know that. I'd
Because they
just
came from
like
that.
to.
No, but that was applied for and granted in that particular year. So we'd have to do over time, the number of units that have MCI. We could try to. It would.
Age of the housing stock, if you excluded the Fortran M&A, it's probably every building.
Applies for an MCI. It's
Every building.
5 years.
Well-
20 years, right? So, I mean, you would have had a new roof. If you were a building built before 1980, you've had 2 new roofs, 3 new roofs.
So it's not going to help us. You're
It's just going to pull everything. It's just going to be a kitchen sink.
okay. Okay. I guess I thought maybe
I have some more, but I feel like I might be trying the patience of the other members of the board. So
Well, one question I have is whether lunch is here.
The lunch has been here for the last half hour, so lunch is
Well,
here.
why don't we have lunch and we could continue to talk, or
As long as we're on the camera and the mic, we can certainly do that if you want to.
They
But
can
it has
watch
to
us
be.
eat.
Stuff our faces
It has to be done in as an open meeting. That's all. And it will be all videotaped. So if you want to be videotaped eating,
Eat like this.
I don't know. It's completely up to
Well,
you.
what do people want to do? Take a break and eat and then reconvene maybe, instead of trying to eat and talk at the same time? Okay, so maybe
could all
if
use
we
a break.
took, like 20, 25 minutes to eat, and then we still leave a little time for further discussion before the next guest?
So when do you want to come back?
Well, why don't we come back at 12:45?
Give us 15 more minutes. Sure.